Tehran, Iran, January 31st, 2018. The winter chill seeped through the cracks of the nondescript warehouse in the industrial sprawl of Courier, a southern suburb where the city's pulse faded into the hum of forgotten machinery and distant traffic. Inside, under the faint glow of a single desk lamp, a woman named Farah Khosravi sat alone, her fingers trembling slightly as she unfolded a crumpled piece of paper from her coat pocket. It was a love letter, or so it appeared, scrawled in elegant Persian script, words of longing, and whispered promises that any prying eye might dismiss as the desperate plea of a heartbroken lover. But Farah knew better. This was no ordinary note. It was her lifeline, her betrayal, and perhaps her death sentence. Farah was 38, a mid-level archivist at the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, a position she'd earned through years of quiet diligence in the shadows of Tehran's bureaucratic machine. Born in Isfahan to a family of engineers, she'd grown up idolizing her father, a man who'd worked on the Shah's nuclear dreams before the revolution shattered everything in 1979. Now, here she was, custodian of secrets that could reshape the world, or end it. The letter in her hands wasn't from a suitor. It was a coded directive from a voice she'd only heard in fleeting phone calls, a handler she knew only as Elias. He was MOSSAD, Israel's relentless intelligence arm, and he'd turned her world upside down 6 months earlier with a single encounter in Vienna. It had started innocently enough, or so Farah told herself in the sleepless nights that followed. In July 2017, during an International Atomic Energy Agency conference in the Austrian capital, she'd met a charming academic named Elias Roth at a reception overlooking the Danube. He was Israeli, he admitted with a disarming smile, but his questions about Iran's peaceful nuclear pursuits felt genuine, probing without aggression. Over coffee the next day, he spoke of his own losses. A sister killed in a Hezbollah rocket attack during the 2006 Lebanon War, and Farah, whose marriage had crumbled under the weight of her husband's suspicions about her late hours at work, found herself opening up. She talked of her doubts, the whispers among colleagues about the regime's hidden ambitions, the centrifuges spinning not just for energy, but for something far deadlier. Elias listened, his eyes steady, and by the end of the week, he'd planted the seed. "What if you could stop a war before it begins?" he'd asked, his voice low as they walked through the Prater amusement park, the Ferris wheel turning lazily above them. Farah had laughed it off then, but the seed took root. Back in Tehran, the emails started, innocuous at first, then laced with requests for minor details, a floor plan here, a shift schedule there. Each time, Farah rationalized it. She wasn't betraying her country. She was saving it from the madmen in power who dreamed of mushroom clouds over Tel Aviv. Now, on this frigid January night, the stakes had escalated beyond her wildest fears. The warehouse she guarded wasn't just any storage facility. It was the heart of Iran's clandestine nuclear archive, a vault of 1/2 ton of documents, 55,000 pages on paper, another 55,000 files on 183 CDs, detailing 2 decades of deception. Project MOSSAD, the regime's covert weapons program, had been shelved in 2003, or so Tehran claimed to the world. But here, in binders labeled with innocuous codes, lay the truth. Blueprints for warheads, simulations of detonations, memos on uranium enrichment at secret sites like Fordow and Natanz. Farah had access because her role involved cataloging these relics, ensuring they remained buried from IAEA inspectors who poked around under the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The nuclear deal brokered by Obama, hailed as a diplomatic triumph, but viewed in Jerusalem as a ticking time bomb. As Farah scanned the letter again, her heart pounded. The words were poetry. "My dearest, the roses in our garden wilt without your touch. Remember the night under the stars in Shiraz, when we promised eternity?" But embedded in the script, visible only under a specific light or through a cipher she'd memorized, were instructions. Elias wanted the keys, digital access codes to the CDs, photographs of select documents, and a sample binder smuggled out. Hidden in a love note, he'd said in his last encrypted message. Make it personal. Make it invisible. Farah's hands shook because she knew what this meant. If caught, it wasn't just prison. It was execution, her name erased, her 2 young daughters left to the mercy of a regime that devoured its own. Outside, the wind howled against the metal doors, masking the faint sounds of movement in the shadows. Farah didn't know it yet, but she wasn't alone in her vigil. Across the city, in a safe house tucked into the Elburz Mountains foothills, Yossi Cohen, the director of MOSSAD since January 2016, paced before a bank of monitors. At 56, Cohen was a legend in Israel's intelligence community, a former operative who'd risen through the ranks with a blend of charisma and ruthlessness. Nicknamed the Model for his sharp suits and Hollywood looks, he was the architect of operations that had crippled enemies from Damascus to Dubai. But Iran's nuclear program haunted him like no other threat. We cannot allow the Ayatollahs to get the bomb, he'd told Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in a tense meeting at the Courier in Tel Aviv just weeks earlier, on December 15, 2017. It's existential. Cohen's obsession traced back to 2002, when the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, an Iranian opposition group, first exposed Natanz and Iraq, forcing the world to confront Tehran's ambitions. By 2010, Mossad and the CIA had unleashed Stuxnet, the cyber worm that destroyed 1,000 centrifuges at Natanz, buying time, but not peace. Assassinations followed. Masoud Ali Mohammadi blown up outside his home in Tehran on January 12, 2010. Majid Shahriari killed in a drive-by on November 29 that same year. Cohen, then deputy director, had overseen some of those hits, each one a calculated strike to slow the scientists' progress. But the program persisted, morphing under Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei's iron grip. The 2015 deal, which lifted sanctions in exchange for limits on enrichment, had only emboldened Iran in Cohen's eyes. Sunset clauses meant restrictions would expire by 2025 and 2030, paving the way for a breakout. Netanyahu, ever the hawk, agreed. We need proof, he'd demanded, something undeniable to show the world. That's when Cohen greenlit Operation Nuclear Heist, the raid on the warehouse. But it hinged on insiders like Farah, recruited through layers of deception. In the safe house, Cohen stopped pacing as a field agent whispered into his earpiece. Assad is in position. Team inbound. The Mossad squad, 22 operatives handpicked for their Farsi fluency and urban stealth, had infiltrated Tehran weeks ago, posing as businessmen and tourists. They'd mapped the warehouse using drones no larger than hummingbirds, bribed guards with promises of defection, and rehearsed the extraction in a mock-up built in the Negev desert. Tonight was the culmination: cut through the doors with silent torches, neutralize alarms, load the files into vans disguised as produce trucks, and vanish into the night. Farah slipped the letter back into her pocket, her breath shallow. She thought of her daughters sleeping unaware in their apartment in northern Tehran, and the husband who'd left her 2 years ago, suspecting her late night's hidden affair. If only he knew the truth. The emotional weight pressed on her like the concrete walls around her. Betraying her homeland wasn't abstract. It was the faces of colleagues she'd shared tea with, the pride in Iran's scientific resurgence after decades of isolation. But then she remembered Elias's stories, the fear in Israeli schools during missile alerts, the Holocaust survivors who'd built a nation from ashes, vowing never again. Was she a traitor or a savior? The line blurred in the dim light. A soft click echoed from the far end of the warehouse, the sound of a lock giving way. Farah froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the concealed pistol in her desk drawer, a gift from a paranoid superior. But it wasn't the Revolutionary Guards. It was the team. The lead operative, a woman in her 30s with sharp features hidden under a hijab, emerged from the shadows. Her codename was Layla, but in reality, she was Tamar Avraham, a Mossad Katsa born in Haifa to Iranian Jewish immigrants who'd fled the Shah's fall. Tamar had spent years undercover in Europe, honing her accents and forging identities. Tonight, she was the courier, the one who'd deliver the haul. Farah, Tamar whispered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline. "It's time." Farah nodded, handing over the keys and a small envelope. The love note, now augmented with a micro SD card slotted into its fold, containing scanned excerpts from the most damning files. Warhead designs capable of fitting atop Shahab-3 missiles, yield calculations for 10-kiloton blasts, memos from Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, the program's shadowy mastermind, dated as recent as 2015. Hidden in the romantic prose were steganographic embeds, pixels altered to conceal data invisible to the naked eye. As the team fanned out, loading crates onto dollies with practiced efficiency, tension thickened the air. One wrong move, a tripped sensor, a patrol car lingering too long, and it all unraveled. Tamar felt it acutely. She'd lost a partner in a botched op in Beirut in 2013, a memory that fueled her precision. Farah watched, her stomach churning. This was the human cost, not just documents but lives hanging by threads. Daughters who might wake to an empty home, agents who'd never see Jerusalem again if captured. By dawn, the van slipped away, weaving through Tehran's awakening streets toward exfiltration points. False passports, private jets waiting in Azerbaijan, routes through Kurdistan. Farah stayed behind, her role complete, praying for the defection Elias had promised. But in espionage, promises were fragile. Back in Israel, as the sun rose over Tel Aviv on February 1, 2018, Cohen received the first encrypted transmission. Package secured. He allowed himself a rare smile, knowing this trove would expose Iran's lies, sway Trump to scrap the deal in May, and justify strikes if needed. But victory came with scars, the Farahs of the world, caught in the crossfire of nations' vendettas. The operation's ripple would echo globally, from Washington boardrooms to Vienna negotiating tables, where diplomats grappled with a program that, unchecked, threatened Armageddon. For now, though, in the quiet aftermath, Tamar clutched the love note in her fist, a talisman of deception that had pierced the veil. The convoy of 3 battered white vans rolled north through the pre-dawn gloom of Tehran, their taillights flickering like dying embers as they merged into the sparse traffic on the Hamid Expressway. Inside the middle van, Tamar Avraham sat wedged between 2 crates marked agricultural spare parts, her gloved fingers still wrapped around the love letter that now carried the weight of history. The envelope felt heavier than the half-ton of documents stacked around her, because it was personal. It was Farah's final act, the one that would either grant her freedom or seal her fate. Tamar's pulse hadn't slowed since the warehouse doors had hissed shut behind them at 04:17. Every checkpoint, every stray headlight in the rearview mirror, felt like a finger on the trigger. The driver, a MOSSAD combatant known only as Rami, kept the speed exactly 5 kilometers below the limit, fast enough to blend, slow enough to avoid attention. No one spoke. The only sound was the soft creak of the crates and the occasional crackle of the encrypted comms loop in Tamar's earpiece. Checkpoint Alpha clear. Route to Baku window still open, came the calm voice of the operations controller in Tel Aviv. 6,000 kilometers away, in a windowless room beneath the Glilot junction, Yossi Cohen stood motionless, eyes fixed on a wall of screens. One feed showed thermal satellite imagery of the vans moving like ants along Tehran's arteries. Another displayed the biometric feed from Tamar's subdermal heart rate monitor, steady at 112 beats per minute. Professional. Cohen allowed himself the faintest nod. The hardest part was still ahead. Back in the warehouse, now empty and eerily silent, Farah Khosravi remained at her desk as planned. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her mind. Act normal. Discover the breach at the scheduled hour. Raise the alarm with exactly the right amount of shock. But now that the moment had arrived, her body betrayed her. Her legs felt leaden, her throat dry as ash. At 05:45, she forced herself to stand, walked the rows of ransacked shelves, and let out a scream that was half performance, half genuine terror. Within minutes, the warehouse swarmed with revolutionary guards. Flashlights cut through the darkness, boots pounded on concrete, voices shouted conflicting orders. A colonel with a neatly trimmed beard seized Farah by the arm, his grip bruising. "How long were you alone?" he demanded. She stuck to the script Elias had drilled into her, fell asleep at the desk, woke to find the doors breached. No idea how they bypassed the alarms. Tears came easily. She thought of her daughters and let the fear flood her face. They interrogated her for hours in a windowless room at the nearby IRGC base. Bright lights, repeated questions, threats veiled and unveiled. But Farah had been prepared for this too. MOSSAD psychologists had walked her through every stage of Iranian counterintelligence technique. Good cop, bad cop, sleep deprivation, promises of leniency. She gave them nothing useful, only consistent answers that painted her as a negligent but loyal employee. By late afternoon, they released her with a warning and a tail she could feel on her skin like insects. Meanwhile, the vans reached the outskirts of Rasht by noon, where the Caspian coast's damp air rolled in through cracked windows. Here the team split. 2 vans continued north toward the Azerbaijani border, carrying the bulk of the physical archive, binders, CDs, hard drives sealed in anti-static bags. Tamar and Rami took the 3rd van west, toward a private airstrip hidden among the tea plantations of Lahijan. Their cargo was lighter but infinitely more fragile. The love letter with its micro SD card, plus a single binder containing the crown jewels, detailed schematics for a 2-stage thermonuclear device, dated November 2016, long after Iran claimed Project Ahmad had ended. The flight was a chartered Hawker 800 registered to a shell company in Cyprus. Takeoff came at 1942 local time, just as the sun bled into the Caspian Sea. Tamar finally allowed herself to breathe as the plane climbed through cloud cover. She pulled the envelope from her vest, turned it over in her hands. The paper was cheap, the ink slightly smudged from her sweat. Inside, Farah's handwriting still carried the faint scent of the rosewater she favored. Tamar read the visible text once more. "My soul is restless without you. Come to me before the spring roses fade." Beneath those words lay coordinates, access codes, and scanned pages that proved Iran had never stopped weaponization research. Halfway across Turkish airspace, Tamar inserted the micro SD into a hardened laptop. The files opened like a Pandora S-box. High-resolution photos of metallurgical tests for uranium deuteride initiators, neutron generator designs, explosive lens configurations optimized for implosion. One document, signed by Fakhrizadeh himself, outlined integration plans for a warhead small enough to fit inside the re-entry vehicle of the upcoming Simorgh space launch vehicle. The implications hit Tamar like a physical blow. Iran wasn't years away from a bomb. With this knowledge preserved and updated, they were months away from a testable device if they chose breakout. In Tel Aviv, Cohen received the first batch of images at 23:10 Israel time. He stood alone in the operations theater as the files decrypted on the main screen. Page after page materialized. Undeniable, meticulously organized evidence of systematic deceit. For a man who had spent 2 decades fighting this threat, the moment carried an almost religious weight. He thought of his own children asleep in Herzliya, of the bomb shelters in every Israeli home, of the ghosts of 6 million whispering never again. Then he picked up the secure line to the Prime Minister's residence in Jerusalem. Benjamin Netanyahu was already awake, pacing his study in Balfour Street. When Cohen's voice came through, "It's everything we hoped for and worse," Netanyahu stopped mid-step. "Bring it to me tomorrow," he said quietly. "The world needs to see this." But even as triumph coursed through the MOSSAD corridors, doubt gnawed at Tamar. 30,000 feet above the Black Sea, she stared out at the endless dark and wondered about Farah. Had the tail already tightened? Would the regime connect the missing binder to the quiet archivist who had access? Tamar had promised extraction, new identities in Canada, university places for the girls, a house with a garden. But promises in this business were written in sand. In Tehran, Farah returned to her empty apartment at midnight. The girls were with their grandmother for the weekend, a precaution she had arranged weeks earlier. She poured herself tea with shaking hands, then sat at the kitchen table and opened the drawer where she kept the one photograph Elias had sent her. A grainy image of a Jerusalem street market, golden stone walls glowing in morning light. On the back, in tiny handwriting, "This could be your future." Hold on. She did not sleep that night. Every car engine in the street below sounded like the knock that would end everything. Far away, the plane began its descent toward a military airstrip north of Tel Aviv. Dawn was breaking over the Mediterranean, painting the sky the color of fresh blood. February 2nd, 2018, Oro 6:47 a.m. Nevatim Air Base, southern Israel. The Hawker touched down hard on the cracked desert runway, engines screaming in reverse thrust. Tamar stepped out into a dawn so bright it felt like punishment after the long night. The air smelled of kerosene and hot sand. Waiting on the tarmac was a small reception committee. No brass bands, no cameras. Just Yossi Cohen in a black windbreaker and 4 silent men from Unit 504, Israel's Human Intelligence Directorate. One of them carried a reinforced Pelican case lined with lead foil. The love letter and its lethal cargo went straight into it without ceremony. Cohen's eyes met Tamar's for only a second. No words. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder. Firm, brief, the closest MOSSAD ever came to gratitude. Then turned toward the waiting convoy of unmarked Suburbans. Tamar watched the case disappear into the back of the lead vehicle and felt something inside her chest cave in. She had carried that envelope across 3 countries, and now it was gone, already becoming someone else's weapon. By 09:30, the entire archive, half a ton of paper and plastic, sat in a decontamination hangar that had once housed captured Syrian MiGs. Analysts in white bunny suits moved between tables like surgeons, photographing every page under cold LED light. The CDs spun in air-gapped readers. Hard drives were imaged in triplicate. Hebrew, Persian, and English curses filled the air as the scale of the deception revealed itself in real time. At 11:12, a technician called Cohen over to a monitor. A single folder, buried deep in one of the CDs, was labeled in Farsi. For the eyes of the Supreme Leader only, Phase 2 contingency. Inside were minutes from a closed-door meeting held in MOSSAD on March 9, 2017. Present, Ali Shamkhani, Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, and a man identified only as Brigadier General H.A., widely believed to be Hossein Salami, commander of the IRGC. The topic: how to preserve weaponization know-how after the JCPOA, how to sleep the program in plain sight, until the deal's sunset clauses expired. They had even assigned a code name for the resurrection: Project Green Salt 2. Cohen read the translated excerpt twice, then closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them again, the decision was made. The world had to see this, not summaries, not leaks, the raw truth. But first, Netanyahu wanted a private viewing. That night, beneath the Prime Minister's residence on Balfour Street in Jerusalem, a select audience of 12 gathered in the underground briefing theater. Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman sat stone-faced. IDF Chief of Staff Gadi Eisenkot leaned forward, elbows on knees. The heads of military intelligence and Shin Bet stared at the screen as Cohen narrated, his voice low, almost conversational, the way a man speaks when he is describing the end of the world. Slide after slide, casting blueprints for uranium hemispheres, high-explosive lens tests conducted in Parchin as late as 2015. A letter from Fakhrizadeh to Khamenei, requesting permission to retain 5 complete implosion systems for educational purposes. And the photograph that silenced the room, a grainy image of a metallic sphere the size of a basketball, its surface studded with detonators sitting on a test stand inside Tunnel Complex 3 at Natanz. Date stamped, 14th of February 2016. 9 months after the world celebrated the nuclear deal. When the lights came up, no one spoke for a full minute. Then Netanyahu broke the silence. "How long do we have?" he asked. Cohen didn't hesitate. "If they decide to sprint 18 months to a weaponized device, maybe less." Netanyahu nodded once, as if he had already known the answer. Then we use this to kill the deal, and we prepare the military option. Across the ocean in Tehran, the noose was tightening. Farah's tale had multiplied. 2 cars now, sometimes 3. A new face in the apartment block opposite hers, always reading the same newspaper. On February 4th, her supervisor at the AEOI called her in and informed her almost gently that she was being transferred to a desk job in Bushehr for her own safety. She understood the code: internal exile, the prelude to disappearance. That same evening, she received a one-time text from an unknown number. Roses still blooming. Garden gate open tonight only. 23U. Come alone. She knew what it meant. Extraction. Farah spent an hour with her daughters, memorizing their faces while pretending to help with homework. She kissed them longer than usual, told them she had a late meeting and would be home before breakfast. Then she put on her darkest chador, slipped the Jerusalem market photograph into her brassiere, and walked out into the freezing night. The pickup point was a quiet intersection near Tajrish Square. A silver Paycon taxi idled at the curb, hazards blinking. She recognized the driver instantly. Elias, older than she remembered, hair dyed black, the same calm eyes. He didn't speak, just tilted his head toward the back seat. The moment the door shut, the car pulled away. They drove north, weaving through the sleeping city, past the closed bazaars and shuttered cafes. At the foothills of the Alborz, another vehicle waited, a battered Land Cruiser with muddied plates. Transfer, new driver, no words. Then the climb began, switchback after switchback up the empty mountain road toward the Iraqi-Kurdish border. Farah's hands were ice. She kept expecting headlights behind them, the sudden bark of a Kalashnikov. Instead, there was only the low growl of the engine and the faint smell of Elias' cologne, something citrus and expensive that did not belong in these mountains. At 03:14 on February 5th, they crossed the unmarked line into Kurdistan. Only then did Elias turn in the passenger seat and speak for the first time. "You're safe now, Azizam," he said softly, using the Persian endearment she hadn't heard since her father died. "Welcome home." Farah began to cry without sound, tears sliding sideways across her temples as she stared at the stars through the window. She thought of the warehouse, the love letter, the children she had just orphaned herself from. She had saved millions, perhaps, and lost everything that made life worth living. In Jerusalem, preparations accelerated. Netanyahu scheduled the public unveiling for April 30, 3 weeks before President Trump's deadline to recertify the Iran deal. Every document was translated, cross-referenced, and forensically authenticated. Graphic designers built a presentation that would look like a Hollywood thriller. Dramatic reveals, side-by-side comparisons of Iranian lies versus the captured truth. Behind the scenes, MOSSAD ceded advance copies to trusted journalists at the New York Times, Der Spiegel, and Le Monde, ensuring the story would detonate globally the moment Netanyahu stepped onto the stage. And in a quiet safe house outside Haifa, Tamar sat alone on a narrow balcony overlooking the sea, chain-smoking and staring at the horizon. She had delivered the impossible, yet sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Farah's face in the warehouse light, brave, exhausted, already half a ghost. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the one thing she had kept. The original envelope, now empty, its love poem faintly visible under the patio lamp. Tamar turned it over in her fingers, tracing the dried rosewater stain. She knew what came next. Exposure, diplomatic chaos, maybe war. And somewhere, in a small apartment in northern Tehran, 2 little girls were waking up to an empty home, and a note that would never explain why their mother had vanished into the night. April 30th, 2018, 20 p.m. sharp. Studio 1, Government Press Office, Kaplan Street, Jerusalem. The stage was simple. A black curtain, the blue and white flag, a single lectern. But the room crackled with anticipation. Cameras from every major network lined the back wall like artillery. Journalists from Tokyo to Washington filled the seats, notebooks open, phones silenced. They had been told only that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu would make a major announcement regarding Iran. Netanyahu stepped into the lights precisely on time. No entourage, no notes. Just a remote clicker in his right hand and a look in his eyes that most Israelis recognized instantly. The look he wore when the nation's survival was on the line. He began in Hebrew, then switched to English for the world. "Tonight," he said, voice steady, "I am going to reveal one of the greatest achievements in the history of Israeli intelligence. Tonight, we are going to expose the truth about Iran's secret nuclear weapons program." The first slide appeared behind him, a nighttime satellite photograph of the nondescript warehouse in Shahr-e-Ray. A red circle highlighted the building. On the night of January 31st, 2018, Netanyahu continued, Israeli agents carried out a daring operation deep inside Tehran. In less than 7 hours, they broke into this secret atomic archive, removed half a ton of material, files, presentations, photographs, videos, blueprints, and brought it back to Israel. Gasps rippled through the press corps. A BBC correspondent half stood before sitting back down. Slide after slide followed, each more damning than the last. "Here," Netanyahu said, pointing, "is Iran's own diagram of a nuclear warhead designed to fit inside a Shahab-3 missile. The screen filled with a clean engineering drawing, clearly labeled in Farsi, dated 2003, showing a re-entry vehicle with a payload section perfectly sized for a 10 to 20 kiloton implosion device. Here are photographs of the metal casting chamber used to form the uranium core." The image was unmistakable, a gleaming hemispherical mold under harsh workshop lights. "And here," he said, pausing for effect, "is an Iranian presentation from 2013, 8 years after they claim they abandoned their military program, detailing 5 separate sites still working on neutron initiators." By the time he reached the final slide, a montage of CDs labeled with Project Ahmad codes, the room was silent except for the frantic clicking of camera shutters. Netanyahu concluded with a direct address to the Iranian people. "We have no quarrel with you," he said softly. "Your regime lies to you. It steals from you to build weapons that will never make you safer. We are showing you the truth tonight because we believe you deserve to know." When the lights came up, the questions erupted like gunfire. But Netanyahu took none. He simply turned and walked off stage. Within minutes, the story detonated across the planet. In Washington, President Trump watched the broadcast live from the White House residence. He had already seen advance excerpts, courtesy of a secure MOSSAD drop 2 weeks earlier. The images confirmed every suspicion he had nursed since the campaign trail. On May 8th, 8 days later, he would announce America's withdrawal from the JCPOA, citing the Israeli archive as irrefutable proof of Iranian bad faith. In Vienna, IAEA Director Yukiya Amano convened an emergency session. Diplomats who had spent years defending the deal now stared at authenticated documents proving Iran had preserved its entire weaponization archive in direct violation of its commitments. In Tehran, the regime scrambled. State television denounced the entire presentation as Hollywood-style forgery. But privately, panic consumed the upper echelons. How had MOSSAD known the exact location? Who inside had guided them? The hunt for traitors became frenzied. Farah, now living under a new name in a quiet suburb of Toronto, watched Netanyahu's speech on CBC with her daughters asleep in the next room. When the warehouse photograph appeared on screen, her breath caught. She recognized the angle, the same one she had photographed months earlier and hidden inside the love letter. Seeing it projected to the world felt surreal, like watching her own heart laid bare. She turned off the television and walked to the window. Snow was falling gently on the unfamiliar street. For the first time in years, no one was watching her from across the road. In Jerusalem, the celebrations were muted. Mossad headquarters threw no parties. There were no victory parades. Yossi Cohen gathered the Operation S core team in a secure briefing room the morning after the speech. 25 people, including Tamar, sat around a long table. Cohen spoke for less than 5 minutes. "You did something historic," he said. "Because of you, the world now sees what we have always seen. But history will also judge us by what comes next. Iran will not stop. They will rebuild, rebrand, burrow deeper. Our work continues. He paused, scanning their faces. And remember the price. There are people who can never come home because of what we did. Honor them by staying sharp. Tamar met his gaze and nodded. She had not slept properly since the night in the warehouse. The empty envelope still sat in her bedside drawer, a reminder that triumph in intelligence is never clean. Across the border in Tehran, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh read the translated speech in his secure office. He underlined certain passages, then summoned his deputies. The archive's loss was catastrophic, but not fatal. The knowledge lived in heads, not just files. They would decentralize, digitize, disguise. The program would evolve, and somewhere in the labyrinth of the IRGC, a new directive went out. Find the woman who had access to the archive. Find anyone who ever spoke to an Israeli. Leave no stone unturned. The raid had changed the board, but the game was far from over. In the months that followed, sanctions snapped back with crippling force. Iran's currency plummeted. Protests flared in the streets. Hardliners tightened their grip, blaming Israel and America for every hardship. And in quiet rooms from Langley to London, intelligence chiefs pored over copies of the archive, realizing the narrowness of the escape. A single insider's courage, a single night's audacity, had bought the world time it did not know it desperately needed. But time, in the shadow war between Jerusalem and Tehran, has always been a borrowed thing. December 28, 2025, 07:12 a.m. A small cafe on Dizengoff Street, Tel Aviv. Tamar Avraham sat alone at an outdoor table, a black coffee cooling untouched in front of her. The morning was crisp, the kind of winter light that made the city feel newly washed. Pedestrians streamed past, soldiers on leave, mothers with strollers, old men arguing about politics over tiny cups of mud-thick espresso. Normal life, the kind she had spent 15 years protecting from a distance. She wore civilian clothes now, jeans, a wool sweater, hair loose for the first time in years. Retirement had come suddenly, 6 months earlier, after a routine medical check revealed the toll of too many operations. Elevated cortisol, a heart murmur that whispered warnings. MOSSAD had thanked her with a quiet ceremony, a modest pension, and a new apartment overlooking the sea. They had not asked her to stay. Across the table lay a single envelope. Plain white, no writing on the outside. It had arrived the night before, slipped under her door by a courier who vanished before she could open it. Inside was a photograph, and a short note in handwriting she had never forgotten. The photograph showed 2 teenage girls standing in front of Niagara Falls, arms around each other, laughing into the spray. The older one had Farah's eyes, dark, serious even in joy. On the back, in careful English, "They are happy. They ask about you sometimes, though they do not know your name. Thank you for giving us this life." The note was simpler, just 6 words. "The roses are still blooming. F." Tamar turned the photograph over again, tracing the edges with her thumb. 7 years had passed since that night in the warehouse, yet the image of Farah's trembling hands handing over the love letter remained sharper than anything in her recent memory. She had followed the girls, progressed through occasional encrypted updates from MOSSAD's resettlement desk. New schools in Canada, university acceptances, the slow healing of lives uprooted. But this was the first direct contact, a risk for Farah, a gift for Tamar. She slipped the photograph into her wallet next to the faded Jerusalem market picture she had carried since 2018. In the years since Netanyahu's speech, the world had shifted on its axis. Trump's withdrawal from the deal in May 2018 unleashed maximum pressure sanctions that crippled Iran's economy. Oil exports collapsed. The rial lost 90% of its value. Street protests erupted in 2019, brutally suppressed. The regime survived but scarred and furious. Covert war intensified. In November 2020, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh was assassinated outside Tehran, shot by a remote-controlled machine gun in an operation widely attributed to Mossad. Iran retaliated through proxies, rocket barrages from Gaza, drone attacks on Saudi oil facilities, Houthi missiles toward Israeli airspace. Tit for tat, calibrated to avoid all-out conflict. Yet the nuclear program crawled forward in hardened underground halls at Natanz and Fordo. New, faster centrifuges spun. Uranium enriched to 60%. A hair's breadth from weapons grade. By 2024, Western intelligence estimated Iran could produce enough fissile material for 1 bomb in a week, for 10 in a month. The archives stolen in 2018 had delayed them, exposed them, forced them underground, but it had not stopped them. And then, in October 2024, everything changed again. A joint Israeli-American cyber operation, successor to Stuxnet, crippled Natanz's power supply, destroying thousands of centrifuges. Iran responded with a massive missile and drone barrage on Israel, the largest in history. Most were intercepted, but fragments killed civilians in Tel Aviv and Haifa. Israel struck back hard. Air forces hammered IRGC bases, missile factories, and, crucially, remaining enrichment infrastructure. By December 2025, a fragile ceasefire held. Iran's program was set back years, perhaps a decade. Diplomats whispered of new talks, a revised deal with stricter limits and intrusive inspections. No one believed it would last forever, but breathing room had been bought, at terrible cost. Tamar knew none of the details anymore. She was out, but she felt the echoes in every siren, every news alert. Her phone buzzed. A text from an old colleague still inside. "You seen this?" Attached was a link to an article in Haaretz. The headline read, "Declassified, the full story of the 2018 Tehran archive heist." The piece was long, carefully sourced, based on documents quietly released by the Prime Minister's office on the 7th anniversary. It named no operatives, but described the operation in unprecedented detail. The warehouse breach, the half-ton exfiltration, the insider who made it possible. There was even a redacted photograph of the famous love letter, its poetic cover text visible, the hidden data blacked out. At the end, a quote from Yossi Cohen, now retired himself. This was not about stealing papers. It was about preventing a second Holocaust. One woman's courage, and the bravery of many others, gave the world the truth when it needed it most. Tamar read it twice, then closed the phone. She looked up at the sky, clear, endless blue, and felt something loosen inside her chest. Not peace, exactly. Espionage rarely grants that. But closure, perhaps. A circle completed. The cafe owner approached, refilled her coffee without asking. "Everything okay?" he asked in Hebrew. She smiled, small but genuine. "Yes. For today, everything is okay." In Toronto, Farah, now calling herself Mina, stood at her kitchen window watching the same winter sun rise over snow-covered roofs. Her daughters were home for the holidays, music drifting from upstairs. She held a cup of tea laced with rosewater, the scent carrying her back across oceans and years. She thought of the warehouse, the cold January night, the moment she chose to betray everything she had been raised to believe in. She thought of Tamar's steady eyes in the shadows, of the promise kept against all odds, and she thought of the world that had not ended in fire, at least not yet. Somewhere between them, across continents and identities, two women who had never spoken more than a handful of words to each other shared the same quiet truth. The roses were still blooming, and for now, that was enough.